For those of you who have joined some of our series to date, welcome to the first of our 2022 series, the Dean's Distinguished Speaker Series. We're still Zoom, and where we in North Ryde, we'd be welcoming you all onto the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Darug Nation. For now, let us welcome you all onto the lands that you respectively meet on in Australia, or perhaps in some cases beyond. I think there are upwards of 400 or so people joining, students, staff, and alumni alike. Tonight's session is called Global Finance and the Expat Life in Asia. And it's a great privilege as the Dean to welcome Ben Way to tonight's discussion. Ben is the Group Head of Macquarie Asset Management and a member of Macquarie Group's Executive Committee. Based in Hong Kong, he leads a team of more than 2,300 people. Ben is also the Chair of Good Financial, a fintech leading solutions for migrant workers. He's a Board of Directors member of Mother's Choice, an organisation whose goal is to see every child in a safe, loving and permanent family. And he's also a generous donor and benefactor to Macquarie University, and he'll say more about that later. Previously, he was the Chairman and CEO of Taiwan Broadband Communications and a management consultant with Bain & Company. Ben graduated from Macquarie University in 1997 with a Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Arts, and is a fellow of the 2017 class of Finance Leader Fellowships and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So Ben, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here, and evening, everyone.
Ben, you're joining from London, so I think it's an early start for you. So Ben, look, maybe to start, can you just give us a bit of a précis of your current role? I know you've nearly taken on the role of the head of Macquarie Asset Management, and can you just give us, before we get into the detail, what your day-to-day job involves at present?
Yeah, sure. So I've been almost for a year the head of Macquarie Asset Management. So we are the asset management group within the broader Macquarie Group. We manage $750 billion on behalf of institutional and wholesale clients. And effectively what we do is we match, that capital with opportunities all around the world through a variety of products. So it could be in public equities and fixed income, which is really traditional asset management. But what we're also known for is things like infrastructure, agriculture, renewables, which is more alternative investing, where we match capital with opportunities in those areas. So, as an example, we, are the investor in more than 150 infrastructure companies right around the world. So everything from data centers to wastewater to toll roads and the like. So that's what we do. We do it in sort of more than 30 markets around the world. We've been doing it for a very long time. So it's truly a global business. And from my sort of day-to-day role, it's really, a few things, engaging with clients all around the world to making sure that we understand what they're looking for and that we're delivering on that and building long-term enduring relationships. It's obviously about leading people and fostering talent. And it's also about investing. So I still sit on a number of investment committees where we're making decisions, on behalf of our clients, whether this makes sense from an investment point of view and those sorts of things. So it's really about clients. It's around people. It's around engaging with our other stakeholders, and it's about making investment decisions.
Can you give us a bit of a view of how your own direct team is structured in the structure of the business? I know that you're currently in Hong Kong, you're potentially making the move to New York, but can you say a little bit about how that sits within the structure of your own team and the business overall?
Well, we have a truly global team, as Macquarie is a truly global business, albeit, our heritage and our head office is still, in Sydney. But the majority of people that I work with live outside of Australia. They live all around the world. And so my reports live where it makes most sense for them in terms of the size of the market and the size of the team. So I've got, colleagues and people living in New York. I've got people living in Sydney, people living in London. So, we do, we've over the last 2 years done everything by Zoom, but what we want to do is really have people closest to the biggest markets and being really able to have teams that are a reflection of the communities in which we're operating. So, we have people from all different backgrounds. So it's a very diverse team and it's a very global team. And the reason why that's important is, to be able to meet with clients, to identify opportunities, to recruit the best people, you can't do that from one market. And that's really a philosophy that I think resonates right throughout Macquarie. A large amount of people that sit on the executive committee and, ultimately report to Shamara. We have people living again all around the world because, we want to make sure that, we're all in different markets, not just in Australia, and we have that truly global presence.
With that in mind, I want to bring you back to where it all started, because I know there'll be a lot of people on this call thinking about how they might one day be Ben Way, or otherwise they might be thinking about how they can be your client. But Ben, can you tell us where you grew up, and what life looked like when you were growing up in Sydney?
Yeah, I had a very, sort of traditional, simple childhood. I sort of grew up in one house in the lower North Shore. Went to two schools before primary school and a high school before I went to university. Had never left Australia until I actually went to university and was afforded the opportunity to go overseas with some financial aid from Macquarie, actually, to go to some debating tournaments. So I had a pretty small, simple life. I grew up in a single parent family. So we were not, my mum was sort of a working class person. And, really for us, it was all about education, right? Just having access to, good public schools and to, good universities. And that's really, so I've been pretty fortunate to be a benefactor of, the Australian system and being able to access things like, education and the like.
So when you finished Year 12, Ben, and I know you would have got your equivalent of the ATAR, a number of students got that recently. How did you think about your life and your choices, and how did you end up at Macquarie University?
When I finished high school, and you get your mark, I really wanted to study law. That was what I was interested in. I kind of had this romanticized version of, I think, created by American TV shows, that I would be, sort of a litigation type lawyer. Turns out that, that's actually not kind of what generally happens as a lawyer. But I didn't discover that until I kind of got to law school. And, when I got my marks, a number of other friends, sort of, it just made sense to go to Macquarie. So I made that decision. That's where I could get in. And, I had a really great sort of 5.5 years there. So
can you tell us a bit about, reflecting now on some of those meaningful experiences there? I mean, I'm conscious that it's orientation week for our first year students in 2 weeks' time, but, it's partly what you learn in the classroom, and there may have been some teachers, but it's also what happens beyond the classroom. Can you just tell us what still sticks with you from your time at Macquarie on campus?
Yeah, well, probably three things. The first and most important thing is I actually met my wife at university when I was 20. And it was a Tuesday afternoon, actually, a sunny Tuesday afternoon that I met her. And so that's probably the most important thing that happened to me at university, for sure. So that was, life-changing. And
she was doing education, was she? What was she doing?
Yeah, she was studying to be a teacher, and she'd had a lot of gap years. So actually, if she hadn't had a lot of gap years, we wouldn't have met. So that was also fortuitous. So I think that's the first thing. Like, I made a lot of friends, and I really do believe in, I think the point you're making is, university it's important to, study and to get good marks. But I loved the whole campus life. And I think the second thing was I really first got introduced to business through Macquarie University, because I was the president of the Students' Union. And that was where I really understood the importance of running a business, the importance that had to the staff that worked at that business, but also the fact that, the students and the staff of Macquarie, the members, if you like, of that Students' Union, and being relevant to them and constantly evolving, and knowing that their needs and sort of interests were evolving, the Students' Union had to evolve with that. So that's where I really first became interested in business. So I think that's the second thing. And then the third thing is, I was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities, both, from, touch rugby and rugby to debating to the Students' Union. I was on the board of the university for a year. And so I got to see lots of different parts of the university, and I really loved that. I loved having that sort of full experience. And, that's not for everyone, but I really enjoyed being involved in a lot of different things. And, the thing about being involved in debating is, as I said before, is that's really the first time I got to go overseas, which is to go to a debating tournament that was, sponsored by Macquarie. And it also really helped me see that the world is a big, dynamic, exciting place. And, the first time I went over to, went overseas was actually to the UK, where I am today. And I went to debate at Oxford. And I think really made me realize that here was like, here I was in the Oxford Union debating in their chamber, and not only were we there, but also we actually, could hold our own, and we were doing well. And I think that was the second thing, is that, it really reminded me that actually, we do have a point of difference, and we can compete globally. And I think that really gave me a taste for, wanting that sort of big international life.
Building on that a little bit, I mean, one of the things that I talk with my deputies and our course directors every day is, how do we help our students find their vocation and, their job and path to employment? Can you tell us a little bit about your first job out of uni? Where did you start your kind of, rung on this incredible ladder you've been climbing?
Yeah. I'd studied, law and international relations, but as I said, I really loved being involved in a business when I was at Macquarie. And the thing I realized is, to be honest, I needed to get a job where I would get that sort of core business training and analyst skills. And so I joined, out of university. My job was with Bain & Company, which is a US headquartered management consulting firm. And the thing that really drew me to that was, one, they really invested in training. So you did a lot of training both in Australia and the US. Two, you got exposure to a lot of different industries. And the other thing too, as part of that program, you got to spend some time living and working overseas. So while I joined in the Sydney office, you then got the chance to do a transfer to, wherever you really wanted to go. And so I was really attracted by that because I wanted to have that international experience and see more of the world. And, that was a really great job. I worked at Bain for about 5 years, and I learned a lot about business. I'll be honest with you, I was not the world's best analyst. And it's lucky that I started with some really other smart people who were much more masters of Excel and other things than I were, because, they were really they were, if you like, my tutors on the side. But I loved working there. I loved working for an American global firm and the sort of perspective they brought. And, the really interesting thing about Bain, which was that they would talk about purpose and having, a North Star back in 1998, before it was actually, sort of became mainstream. They really were about, it's a for-profit business that's about giving advice, but it's about, really giving the right advice and trying to have an impact with your clients. And I really, I found that really interesting, really inspiring. But what I did love is, if you were a curious person, you got to work in different industries all the time. And so you were always learning about, new markets, new products, and, also getting really good exposure to quite senior people and being able to observe and learn from them as well. So, it was a really great opportunity, and that's really, I suppose how I first moved overseas.
So tell us about that, because that was also your foray into Asia, if I'm not mistaken, that you were meant to move to the US, and then you got diverted north.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting, I wouldn't have thought when I was graduating university that I would be moving and, end up living in Asia for more than 20 years. So, I didn't have a grand plan, and I didn't even have that expectation. And I was meant to be moving to San Francisco because I started to really focus on tech and telecommunications type clients as I spent more time at Bain. And just through chance, I was talking to, the regional HR director, and they were just saying, we can't get people to take up some of these other transfer opportunities in places like China. And my then very pregnant wife with our first daughter, when I was telling her that night that, just sort of relaying the conversation, it was actually her idea, saying, we should go to China. That's a much more interesting experience. We can always go to the US, but, sort of China's going to be an amazing market. And she was much more well-traveled than I. And I think, as I said to you, sort of, Eric, in a pre-meeting, I'd never been to Asia before. I'd certainly never been to China before. I knew nothing about China. So I went back to work the next morning, and we didn't have Google then. I think I used Alta Vista, and I inputted Starbucks, China. And that was literally my test. I didn't even know if they had coffee there. That's how kind of crazy and ignorant I was. It's a little bit embarrassing. And it just so happened that there was then in Beijing 4 Starbucks, and one of them happened to be in the building where the Bain office was. And I sort of using that, I thought, okay, well, if they've got a Starbucks, which, by the way, I really didn't know much about either, but I don't know why I used that for the test, then, I'll be able to survive at least a year there. And so, I went to HR and said, look, we can go to San Francisco another time. We'd love to go to Beijing. And so, sort of like literally 2 months later off we went with a few bags and a baby. And, it was kind of interesting because when I got there, we didn't have things like intranets and all those sorts of things. So when I turned up, people for about the first 2 days were very quiet because they thought Ben Wei, given my last name, I was Chinese. So they weren't expecting to see me there because no one had actually seen any photos of me, and it was, sort of a slightly less connected time. But, it really changed our life. And it was, we had a fantastic, we've lived in Beijing twice, but we had a fantastic, fascinating first stint there. And that's really, I think, that's led to sort of a long career, living and working across Asia. So I think that's just, a good example of taking a chance, doing something that's a bit different. And, sometimes you can have plans and sometimes you can just sort of live and sort of enjoy what's in front of you. And that's really what we did. And, from there, we've, been, sort of there ever since, really.
So can you talk me a little bit from Bain in Beijing and your pathway into Macquarie? Because I think there's a tight set of loops here, if I'm not mistaken, into Thailand, parts in Singapore, can you just talk us a bit through your kind of pathway? Because I think some of the questions that came through, we were just interested in your mobility and your mindset as you moved between these different places.
We moved to Beijing and lived there for a number of years. And then I had an opportunity with Bain to move to Bangkok. So we moved down to Bangkok and lived there for a number of years. And actually, that's where our second daughter was born. And then I actually moved back to Australia for about a year. And, as I said, I was involved in student politics and I was involved in debating. And I had always thought about the idea of, perhaps I should move back to Australia and become a politician and all the like. And so I moved back. And after about 6 weeks back in Australia, I realized that actually that wasn't for me anymore. And so,
what were you doing in those 6 weeks? What were you?
I honestly just, I had an enormous amount of coffees with people. And again, I think I had a sort of romanticized idea what it was to be a politician. And, obviously it's much harder to be a politician than a business person. It's much harder to run a government than it is a company. And, I'm really thankful for the people that do dedicate their lives to that world. But I just sort of, after meeting a lot of people and understanding sort of, I suppose, being more analytical about what it would be involved, but also actually understanding what we were giving up in terms of the sort of world that we had started to live in terms of just that travel and being in different markets and having that different experience. I think we just realized that it made sense to move back to Asia. And I'd actually taken about to accept a job in private equity back in Singapore. And I was introduced to someone from Macquarie who I really didn't have a big knowledge of. If you asked me then what did Macquarie do and what was its global footprint, I really didn't have much of an idea. But I was introduced to the now CFO of Macquarie Group, Alex Harvey, by a friend. And Macquarie just bought a business in Taiwan, which was a really big investment and really a bold new initiative for Macquarie. It was a new market, it was a new sector, and they were looking for a CEO of that business. And I had a coffee with Alex on a Tuesday, and 3 weeks later I moved to Taiwan. And I was the CEO of a portfolio company there for a number of years before I moved into the funds business that owned that portfolio company. But I think it's a good example of mobility. Now I've been really lucky that, I'm married to a very flexible, open person who, is willing to move and, is excited about moving and living in different markets. So that's been great. And, obviously my kids have been very mobile, but it's a good example of, again, I wasn't expecting that opportunity. It obviously involves some risk in taking that, it was sort of moving again from Sydney to somewhere like Taiwan, which is, again, a place I'd never been to before. But it turned out, it was a great job. It was a fantastic job running a regulated communications business in Taiwan. I met really interesting people. It was my first real CEO job. And I was a pretty young CEO, but, I wouldn't have been able to get that job at that time in a market like Australia or the US or Hong Kong. So I had to actually do something a little bit different and take some risks to be in a market like that. And again, that sort of job really changed my life. I loved the challenge of leading a team, I loved working in that cross-cultural environment, but it also introduced me into the world of Macquarie, and that's fundamentally changed my life. And all because of, a coffee in Sydney on a Friday afternoon and, taking up an offer to move to Taiwan. And so from there, I worked in Taiwan for, a number of years before I moved to Korea with Macquarie. Then I moved back to China, back to Beijing, and then I moved down to Hong Kong about, sort of 8 years ago. And I've had, the really great thing about that is within that sort of 15-year period now of working at Macquarie, I've had sort of 4 or 5 different roles. And that's what I've loved. I've been able to work in different markets with different people, but doing new, taking on new leadership challenges. And that's been, really, an enormous blessing, to be honest, and something I'm really thankful for.
So just picking up on that Taiwan experience and the movements that took you there, maybe to ask you a set of questions inside the organisation and some beyond it. I mean, inside the organisation, when you're dealing with that functional change, from a consultancy mindset to driving the business from an operational perspective, how, clearly you've got an incredible ability and aptitude to work in ambiguity of a cultural nature, but, from a functional nature, what are the kind of routines or skills or methods that you're putting in place to coach yourself, to train yourself, to develop yourself, to build those skills where you may not necessarily have had that template? It's a kind of a lateral shift in some respects. So I wondered if you could speak a bit to that.
It's a great question. I think ultimately, everyone's about as smart as one another. There's not a big difference in IQ, and most things can be learned. And the things the things you do in business are not that they're not that complex, and you can come up to speed quite quickly. So I think the real sort of difference is, I suppose, getting comfortable that you don't know everything and that you work with other smart people and listening to them and learning from them, being curious. I think that's the first thing. I think you've got to be a good listener, and you've got to be, comfortable to admit, I don't have all the answers, I don't know everything, but, we can learn this and we can work it out together. And I think you have to couple that with effort. I think that's the big differentiator in life, is not, do you want to be successful, but what are you willing to do? And effort comes down to hard work. It also comes down to, I think, investing the time, not just in technical learning, but learning about people and wanting to sort of work with them. And so, one of the things I've really, that has really engages me about, the roles I've had and the culture we have at Macquarie is the fact that you're always being presented with new opportunities to do things. And I think if you're willing to, be accountable for delivering on those opportunities, but also, you want to learn along the way, then, that's a great environment for you. So I think that's really, I think it's really as simple as that. I think it's putting in effort, listening to others, and not thinking that you have to have all the answers. And look, I say that now. Was I always that way? No, of course I wasn't. I've learned along the way and evolved along the way as a leader, as a learner, and as a colleague. But I think it's once you realize the power of the team, and it's all about we, and you also are open to about learning new things, and you don't put up barriers for yourself. And that's what I would say is that, sometimes you see people say things like, oh, I couldn't move overseas, or I couldn't move to this new city because I've got kids. But your kids aren't sending you an email or a text message saying, hey, we can't move, right? The most flexible of people are kids. It's not the adults. So it's about, and I understand that, but so it's about willing to take that risk, to put yourself in, uncomfortable positions sometimes, and also be okay with the fact that you don't have to have perfect knowledge or be an expert on everything, but you can become an expert on things if you give yourself time and if you ask questions and learn along the way. And I think that's the second part of it that, I've sort of, I've really come to appreciate over the years.
And so building on that a little bit on the sort of team dimension of that, because I suppose that's a natural kind of focus for the leader in terms of building the culture and hiring the right people. Can you say something a bit about how you compose teams or what you look for when you build teams? Because as you open this conversation, clearly the geographic diversity of your team is unique and distinctive, and much of the world has had to deal with remote learning. But there's obviously some core or some key attributes that you're looking to kind of double down on or reproduce. whether in the diverse composition of that team or the values or the systems and processes. Can you say a little bit about how you do team building, how you recruit and develop your own team? Yeah.
My approach to sort of life, particularly from a professional point of view, is to do, what I love with people I love. I don't always tell them directly, literally, I love you, but I wanted to work with people that I think are interesting, that are fun, that challenge me, that are aligned with where we want to take any particular opportunity, and I want to do it in a way that I feel proud of, that stands the test of time. And so when I am building any team, when I'm recruiting anyone, I start with finding people of good character. I think that fundamentally trumps everything else. If you find people that are good leaders, that are good people, that have good character, I think everything else follows. So that's what I start with. That's the first thing. The second thing I also love, and I think I stumbled into this, to be perfectly honest, is I really enjoy people who bring different viewpoints, bring different backgrounds. And, I think we now really understand the power of teams that are diverse, inclusive, and equitable. We understand that. And I think it's great that the world has a much more explicit focus on that. And that's become really core to building any high performance team. But before I suppose I was, I really understood the power of that. I sort of stumbled into it. And what I learned early on in living in different countries around the world that had a different culture and to mine and different languages is there was a real power in, when you saw things doing differently or someone have a different viewpoint of actually embracing and celebrating that difference, as opposed to thinking that difference is bad. And so, I'll give you one really practical example is I've lived and worked in a lot of countries where I am not fluent in the language of those markets, but I did bring a different perspective, and I was genuinely open to wanting to understand those cultures more. And I'll never be an expert in those cultures because I wasn't born there, and I don't necessarily speak the language fluently, and there's a lot of nuance to those markets. But I do acknowledge and love the difference of those markets. But I also acknowledge that me bringing a different perspective can be powerful to those teams, just as undertaking, how they think and the way they approach can be really powerful to take that into other environments. And that's what I think you want in your teams. You want people to feel comfortable to voice different viewpoints. You want to be able to debate things respectfully and disagree on things. But you also want to hear people who, come at, any issue from all different vantage points, because I think ultimately what you're searching for is the best direction and the best ideas. And they should be able to, the best ideas are going to and have to come from anywhere. And I think that's the other thing that you need to be open to is how do we take different viewpoints and actually ultimately land on the right answer and then get excited about making that happen. And that's so that they're the sorts of teams that I've tried to build and tried to be part of over the last 20 years.
So building on that a little bit, Ben, I mean, clearly a lot of the questions that have come in have been about how you appraise and assess opportunity. In the diverse kind of markets that you've had to operate in. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how you filter and think about opportunity and by extension risk, and potentially you could apply that a little bit into the current role. So as you've moved into asset management, you've been on investment committees and so forth. Can you say a little bit about, when, because not everything's an opportunity. What's the filter and what are the kind of antennae that you've developed to begin to appraise that, and in the Asia context in particular?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is we have, when you meet our teams, whether you're in Korea or India or the Philippines, or quite frankly, if you're in the US or the UK, those teams are normally, as I think I said previously, a reflection of the communities. So, our team in Korea is Korean. And, the reason we want, these empowered local teams is we think they're best placed to spot opportunities and to be able to assess them. And I think that's the case right around the world. You want to have those teams that understand and have the right networks, who understand the culture, who can break down the regulatory environment, the financial environment, and understand it both technically, but also from a social, political, geopolitical point of view, and get the nuance of those markets. So that's the first thing. Is we have great teams around the world who are a reflection of the communities in which they operate, who are empowered to go out and find the opportunities, because we think those who know the markets best and are closer to it are the ones that will be able to identify the best opportunities. So I think it's first making sure you've got teams like that and resources. I think the second thing when we think about opportunities, when I think about opportunities, is it always comes down to a risk reward assessment, and part of that is also built up over years about what are we good at, not trying to be all things to all people. So what are we good at? Understanding the markets from a political point of view, understanding them from a macroeconomic point of view, thinking about what are the long-term thematics and trends, and then trying to invest where you align with markets that you can get comfortable from a sovereign risk point of view, from a regulatory point of view, investing in sectors you think thematically stand the test of time. And then also, because we see opportunities right around the world, being able to draw on the experience of those different teams in terms of learnings that you've built up over the year. What do you need to be aware of in terms of this particular sector, this particular type of company, and making an investment based on that, and again, drawing on all those different experiences. So, the good news from our perspective is, we have a really successful business. It has really great momentum, but doing this over 30 years, you also build up a lot of experience, and you do make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes, right? Because that's if you're not trying new things and doing new things, then you won't be able to move forward. But it's also making sure that you learn from those. So I think that's the sort of it's that sort of collective wisdom. It's the collective experience. That's really what a good investment committee is about. And it's also about making an assessment about where relative value is best at any time. And as we know, that can change quite quickly, and we need to be open to that. That can be changed because of regulatory changes. It can be changed because of consumer sentiment. It can be changed because of geopolitics. And that's what makes, I think, investing a really interesting area, is that you've got to, I think, be alive to all of those issues. But you also got to be, honest that, ultimately, when you make an investment, say in a private equity style business, it also comes down to being able to find really good people to run that business for you. So, you might love the sector, you might like the thematic, but if you can't identify the right people to do it for you, then, you've got to pause on that. And part of being a good investor is knowing when to say no. We probably maybe are too exposed for this. We don't quite understand the risk of this market, so we need to build that up a bit more before we make a big bet. We can't find the right people to buy it. So there's lots of things that go into that you learn along the way into making these decisions, and that's why, again, it's so important to do it from a team point of view, because no one person can truly have all that expertise and all that capability.
What can you say, or are you able to share something about how you're thinking about that, the changing nature of sovereign risk and geopolitical risk in the Asia context, PRC and beyond? I mean, the number of people on this call, I think, are working within Asia, often expats. Can you say a little bit about your assessment and Macquarie's assessment of where we stand?
Well, I think we're a massive believer, I certainly am, of the long-term thematics of Asia as a region. So, we know from a population point of view, we know from growing income, we know from an internationalization of business. Every market in Asia is competing for capital to help drive investment in a whole range of different sectors because of the movement into middle and high income type economies. So I think across it's very hard to generalize about Asia because it's such a diverse, dynamic region. But I would say I think there are all the big markets where there are big populations, big capital pools. I think there are really good investment opportunities, and I think there are over the next sort of 50 to 100 years. Those investment opportunities, though, can be shaped by sort of the happenings of the day, whether it's rising inflation, whether it's geopolitics. And I think that's what you have to be alive to. So it's, to take a long-term view, I think we all understand that the sort of the key drivers of Asia are very attractive in most markets. And, you can see that, say, manifesting at the moment in, say, things like digitalization. There's no region in the world that's more excited from a digitalization point of view. So if you think about the China market from an e-commerce point of view, it's 150 times the size of the US market. If you think about the adoption of fintech in places like Thailand and Indonesia, it's incredibly exciting about the access that people are getting to financial products through things like the smartphone. And that creates a whole other array of investment opportunities, things like the semiconductor industry, things like data centers, which are obviously key building blocks and important inputs to allowing that digital economy to grow. So that's all. I think people see those thematics right across the region. What you have to do then remember is that Asia is not homogenous, and market by market, those thematics are at different points of their evolution, and it's understanding where are you a good investor in that evolution? Is that market right for you? And that often comes down to things like regulation, and that regulation can change from time to time, and that can affect investments. So I think when we look at Asia, we're really excited, but we understand that an opportunity in India is quite different to an opportunity in Japan, which is quite different again to an opportunity in something like Indonesia. And that's, I think, the real art of understanding, broadly, Asia, is that it's, getting the thematic is right, but understanding the way you go about executing that opportunity is very different in those markets. Sometimes it's because of regulation, but sometimes it's just because of the types of access and partners you need. And so I think, again, we're excited about all those markets, but for each market, we have a different thesis and we have a different approach because we acknowledge that those markets are in different evolutionary stages.
And can you say something a bit further then, Ben, on Hong Kong in particular? Because a number of people sort of dial in on that particular point, just given that's your home geography, as it were, at the moment. Can you say something a bit about Hong Kong, and in the context of maybe greater PRC?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing about Hong Kong is, it's evolving, and it's been a great international finance centre for decades. And I think increasingly it's going to play a very important role in being an access point for China, but also in terms of an R&B market. And that's, just a natural evolution, right? China, Hong Kong is the right international access point. If you think about the scale of its market, you think about the regulation for investment into China, and also for China to be able to pull capital from a public markets perspective. So I think, really Hong Kong is just evolving as a marketplace. And, I think, it's incredibly well positioned, just given the scale of the market and the way it's regulated, to play that role for, as an example, for Chinese companies looking to be listed in a truly international market that has true free flows of capital. And I think, markets like, the Shanghai Stock Exchange will move that way as well over time. It's, again, I think we just got to remember that it was only 50 years ago that, China didn't have, a stock exchange. So it's relatively new, versus a lot of other stock exchanges around the world in terms of developing and opening up and getting the scale that you need to run a financial centre. And so at the moment, Hong Kong is a good point because it does have that depth, and it does have that scale, and it does have that internationalisation to help capital flow in and out, and to match capital with opportunities.
So extending on that then, and maybe coming into that second dimension on the personal side, although it has professional overtones. I mean, could you say something a little bit about the value of Asia experience, business experience, back into the Australian market and Australian employers? A couple of questions have come in here around, you're dealing with the reverse culture shock, having worked in Asia and coming back to Australia, but also, how is that international experience valued back in Australia? And this is probably coming from a number of our alums amongst us who are probably thinking, they've done a couple of years in Asia, the borders are closed, they got family back in Australia. What does that experience mean back in Australia? Can you give a perspective on that?
Well, selfishly, I obviously think it's very important to have that experience, because that's what I've had. And it's hard for me to talk to the point about whether it is valued in Australia or not, because I haven't moved back to Australia, and, to be honest, don't intend to move back to Australia anytime soon. From my, when I think I value really highly people having, a diverse experience set. And so in the context of your question, when I see resumes where people have lived and worked in different markets, be it in Asia or other parts of the world, I often look at that, very fondly. Now, that might be some biases given my own personal experience, but I think it's great that people have had, different experiences. And that could be just moving from, from one city in Australia to another. I think where people have got up and moved to another, lived in different areas, had to go and meet new friends, tried new experiences, whether it's between cities or between countries. I value that greatly. I know from a Macquarie experience, that's certainly something we value very highly. And, most of the people that, as an example, are in senior positions, including, our CEO, have lived and worked in lots of different countries around the world. So, Shamara, our CEO, has lived in New Zealand for Macquarie. She's lived in Malaysia and Hong Kong. She lived in the UK, and she also lived in the US before she moved back to Australia to sort of take on the role that I now do before she became CEO. So I think we value that really highly, and I think it's really important. Do I think Australian businesses more broadly always value that? I to be honest, it's hard for me to answer. I can only speak through the lens of the Macquarie experience. We certainly do. Do I think businesses, whether they be in Australia or anywhere else, should value that highly? I do. Yeah. And now I don't think that everyone has to follow the same path. I don't think you have to say you have to live outside your own home country to have a successful career. Of course you don't. Everyone should sort of follow the path that best suits them. And there are obviously lots of factors that go into that. But do I think that people that have had different experiences living in different markets and different cultures should be valued? Absolutely, I do. And I think that's a sign of a mature open market, is where you see the value in people, again, bringing different experiences. Because, a market like Australia, I think, benefits from that diaspora of people who've gone out and seen different things around the world and bring them back to Australia, because I think it helps connect Australia to the rest of the world. I think it helps build that flow of ideas and people. And I think it also ultimately probably allows you to build the best teams.
So, I mean, clearly a key enabling condition in being able to do that, then, besides the opportunities that are afforded you, is the partner that you have, and the family conditions and so forth. And, I suppose this is particularly relevant to some of the MBAs and other students on the call, but I'll read the question here, but maybe you can find a way into it, which is, how disruptive was moving overseas for the family, and what sort of methodologies have you used to adapt and counter living away? I just wondered if you could share a little bit about how you've gone about that as a family.
Yeah, sure. Well, the most important job I'm ever going to have in my life is being a dad, right? By a long way. So, wherever we've moved, our first focus has always been on our kids, making sure that we're getting them into a good school, making sure that we build connections with the community so that they, do the things they love. Whether it was, Girl Scouts or soccer or dance, so making sure that we find those opportunities for them and sign them up for it so that we can kind of have that normalcy. So moving is disruptive, but we've never taken that approach. We've always taken the approach of this is going to be exciting. It's part of our adventure. It's the four of us against the sort of world. And so we've really embraced that. As my kids got older, they wanted, I think, and they wanted sort of a little bit more stability. And that's why, we've spent the last 8-9 years in Hong Kong, partly for their education and partly because as they became teenagers, that was really important to have that, that sort of have more stability and less change. But when they were younger, they were great movers and great travelers. But, obviously, it wasn't always easy making new friends, trying to join a new team, for any kid, whether they're moving suburbs or moving countries, that's not easy. And so, I'm hugely thankful that, my kids have been my daughters have been have been so positive. And, they're now what's described as third culture kids. They speak multiple languages. They now both study in the US, but, they have an Australian heritage. And, I think, they've really embraced the opportunities that we've been afforded. And I think they're really thankful and grateful for that. But, what I would say to anyone is, you've got to, everyone needs to follow their own path. I think if you do what you love and what you're passionate about, and you also, look at change in a positive way, and realize that, there will be lots more benefits to negatives, then it's easier for you to take that risk. But it does come with, it's not all straightforward. You don't see your family as often. You can't get access to all the things that you normally would in your own home, in your own home country. And so you've got to get comfortable with that, and being willing to make those trade-offs. And we've been comfortable doing that. We've embraced that in a really positive way. But it does. It's not without compromise, and it's not without cost, for sure. And then it just comes down to what ultimately you're comfortable with. And luckily for me, my kids don't really know anything different. So, and they didn't really have a choice. But I more importantly had a great partner through all of this who had a career as a teacher. So my wife was very flexible. That's the first thing. And also she was excited about the change. And so we were, I suppose, united around, wanting to do different things and live in different markets and experience different cultures. So, it's probably why we got married and why we're still married, Eric.
So, Ben, I want to ask you a couple of questions that are coming from the audience here, which I think are from the asset managers amongst us. A couple of finance questions, and then I'm going to close out on your broader vision for the contribution you want to make, in your career perspective. But just a few sort of asset management questions. I mean, clearly Macquarie's made public its push into renewables. If you could speak a little bit more concretely to that opportunity, for finance professionals, wanting to enter that space, how to begin to think about that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two ways to think about it. The first is, the existential challenge of our lifetime is getting to net zero. And so I think every organization, every business in the world needs to have that as a strategic priority. If we don't get that right, then, we don't have a world to inhabit. And so, it's time to go beyond ambition and announcements. We need real practical action around that. And clearly, a huge part of getting to net zero is the energy transition to clean, renewable fuels. And from a Macquarie perspective, we've been an investor in the renewable sectors, both in existing and emerging technologies, for a long period of time. And so, why do we do that? Well, first of all, it's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. The world needs a lot more capital, and it needs a lot more innovation when it comes to the energy transition. So it's the right thing to do. I think, secondly, it's an exciting and important investment class which investors want to be associated with. They see that the future, that all great companies, all great businesses going forward will have to be sustainable businesses, and that's been a really, I think, important business mindset shift over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And so I think we understand we've got this huge challenge. If you flip that on its head, what it also presents is probably the biggest investment opportunity of our lifetime. More than $4 trillion is needed per year through to 2050 to get to net zero. And so from a Macquarie perspective, we see this big challenge. We see the need for real action, for real investment, and real progress. But we also see that there's a huge opportunity here from a investment point of view. And we see increasingly governments, investors and communities, needing someone to facilitate that. And as I said, we've got a lot of expertise in doing it around the world. We've been building offshore wind in Europe, in Asia for many years. We're big investors in solar. We're increasingly investing in things like hydrogen and carbon capture and those sorts of things, those newer technologies that will be needed. And so we just see it as a huge opportunity, and we're excited about it. But we're also, I think, very honest that it's a big challenge for the world. And so we see an opportunity to be a leader in that space and to really catalyze investment, which will ultimately lead to change. But certainly, I think the world needs to get a move on in making that happen.
Another question, you spoke a little bit about Alex Harvey as a friend and colleague, CFO at Macquarie, but another question here is, if you're the CFO of a company, during this pandemic crisis, what would be keeping you up at night, or what should be keeping you up at night?
Well, the first thing I'd say to everyone is sleep is your superpower. So don't stay up at night. You need sleep to be able to make good decisions during the day. So whatever you do, get off your screen. Don't drink too much coffee late in the night. and try and get some good sleep, because it will make you a better person and a better leader and be able to make better decisions. I think, look, what are CFOs thinking about? What are leaders thinking about if they're running businesses? I think they're thinking about, a few things, both the short and the long term. I think one of the big things at the moment is, inflation. Everyone's talking about inflation, that quite rightfully, what will that do to businesses? What will that do? What does that mean from a capital structure point of view? What does it mean in terms of your supply chain, your cost of capital, all those sorts of things? So I think people are spending a lot of time talking about that. And that's, again, varies from market to market, where, inflation, say, as it relates to wages, is very different in a market like US versus, a lot of markets in Asia or down in Australia. So, again, I think if you're a global CFO, you're thinking about how that affects different parts of your business, and what it means from a cost of capital point of view, and making sure that your capital structure is robust, and can stand the test of time, where you might see, increases in interest rates and those sorts of things, and access to capital. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing that everyone has been thinking about, whether you're a CFO or a COO or CEO, is obviously people. It's been a really tough 2 years on people. I think, what we've proven over the last 2 years is just how adaptable and resilient and remarkable human beings are. And the fact that, so many businesses around the world have been able to get through the pandemic, in some cases to prosper, is pretty remarkable, to be honest. And people have worked incredibly hard, but it hasn't been easy being on Zoom all the time, and people then having to manage their professional and personal lives, which have been, often, much more difficult to do and much more stressful. So I think everyone is thinking about the well-being of their people, about trying to get some normalcy back to the workplace. And then I think the third thing, people are thinking about is, what will the world look like post-pandemic? What's changing? Not just from a workforce point of view, but, we've seen certain sectors accelerate. We've seen other sectors disrupted, like, the travel industry. And so, depending on the nature of your business, you've got to think about, are you focused on the right sort of sectors, the right sort of markets? How do you position your business, from a capital point of view, from a people point of view, to potentially take advantage of what the world will look like post-pandemic, and what will it look like? And, that's a difficult thing to assess, but I think that's what CFOs are certainly thinking about as well.
So, Ben, I might come to this last point and maybe talk a little bit about legacy. And I started by, acknowledging the benefaction and donations you've given to Macquarie. But maybe you could say a little bit about that, about the contribution you want to make. You've risen so fast, so quickly at such a young age. You've got a long career to play out here. What's the contribution you want to make from here, and where do you see yourself heading there?
Thank you, Eric. Look, I think it's really important, for someone like my wife and I, we've been incredibly fortunate to be the beneficiaries of, education and great opportunities around the world, and we are incredibly thankful for that. And, I think we recognise that, we are, in a position where we can give back to the communities in which we're involved. And, we do that in lots of ways. I serve on boards of NGOs. I help raise funds for those NGOs. My family and I obviously give back to those NGOs, but we also, want to give back to places like Macquarie, who really did change our life, and we were a real beneficiary of, not just the education we received there, but the experiences we received there. And so, we've set up a scholarship, which was my wife's idea, for Indigenous students who are training to become teachers, and then are going back to, rural communities to where there's a real need for, obviously, teachers, and particularly Indigenous teachers in those communities, often teaching Indigenous kids. So that's something we set up at Macquarie, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And we do similar things, sort of around the world and in the different markets we operate. And I think that's because, where you can make a contribution and give back, I think it's incredibly important. And I think we've seen, how difficult, some communities, how many difficulties that communities have faced in the last 2 years. And so, I think that contribution can be big and small. It's not all about, just giving money back. I think giving your time, raising awareness, supporting different courses, that you can do that, big and small, right? And ultimately, I think that comes down to, people just wanting to live in better societies and move them forward. And so I think business and business leaders have a real role to play there. And I think business has become much more conscious about that, and I think is much more leaning into it. And I think that's a really good development. And I think ultimately it comes down to people have realised that we're living in an era of stakeholder capitalism. More is expected of business leaders and business than ever before. I think that's a great thing. And I think business can play a really important role. And I'm really, I'm really proud of being part of Macquarie and what we do from a foundation point of view. And I'm really, and I think, and I've been involved in that for many years. And I think that also, you can also do that, at a personal level. And I think that's important that we sort of give back and are thankful for what we've received over the years. And look, depending on your personal circumstances, not everyone necessarily can, might be in the position to, set up a scholarship like my wife and I have. But there are other ways I think that you can find support. And I think, it's important, no matter the size of that contribution. I think it's just, that's the sort of, I think, community and place that I want to live in. And so I think it's, incumbent on me to play that sort of role and to talk about it. So hopefully that can catalyse others to also think about how they can contribute in whatever way it may be.
And Ben, maybe to close on this note, I know Danny Gilbert from Gilbert and Tobin was one of your mentors into that, but it sounded like he prompted a conversation in your mind. But for people who are thinking about that, what's the conversation starter, or how do you begin to form meaning around that? Is it a conversation with self? Is it with your partner? Like, how do you begin, because of the plethora of things that you could do, how do you begin to find your personal true north, the thing that,
I think it ultimately comes down to what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? And, follow that. So, I'm really passionate about, education and access to education because of my own personal experience, as is my wife, so that we focused on that in many other markets around the world. You mentioned before that I'm involved I'm the chair of a Hong Kong fintech. Well, that's actually about really giving foreign domestic workers access to ethical lending and ethical banking practices. And the way I got involved in that is I've seen bad lending to people that are vulnerable, who are living on very little. And I saw with a partner an opportunity to create a business there that was able to serve them much better in a more ethical way. And that, saves them huge amounts of money. And that's really important because that money that they save, they can then use to repatriate and invest in their communities and to set up their life for retirement, those sorts of things. So that's about financial inclusion and financial equality. And that's something also that I'm really passionate about. So what I'd say is, for anyone, you need to work out, what motivates you, what interests you, and what you love and are interested in doing, and follow that. And I'd say that you should do that for your career, just as you should do it, for your own sort of personal interests in the way you engage in your community.
Well, Ben, look, on behalf of Macquarie Business School and my colleagues at Macquarie University, and for all of us who've joined today, can I just thank you for the generosity with which you've given not only your time, but also your insight and your sense of self and purpose. It's deeply appreciated. It is meaningful to us on this call, but it's meaningful for the generations that will come beyond us, and to hear your words of wisdom. So thank you so much for today. We'll circulate this, and, thank you to all of those who've joined today in joining the first of our distinguished Dean's Speaker Series for 2022. We will do another one of these in a couple of months' time. But for now, happy Chinese New Year. Thank you all for joining, and be well and safe as we head into 2022. Thank you very much.
新年快乐. Thank you.
再见.